Goes without saying that this current, let's call it a crisis between London and Moscow, is the most serious since Cold War. It's almost like a mini Cold War going on between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. Um, I don't want to just repeat the things I've said in the previous videos, but I think this is going to be something that could have implications for a very long time to come. So it's going to continue to be topical. And there are a few things I want to just say from a personal perspective on how I feel about this. Firstly, it's it's an attack on our sovereignty. There will be people who say that even if it was Russia, it's an internal thing because it was targeted at a former KGB agent, FSB agent. Um, but they're missing the point that this was in a public area and it was on British soil. There have been reports that up to 40 people have been treated in hospital but released um, as a result. Not to forget the policeman who is also in critical condition. So I don't accept that line that it's not an attack on Britain because it is. The people who done this, I mean the individuals who done it, anyone who's paying attention knows it was Russia. Knows that there's no rational question about that because if you play the line of, well, let's see the evidence. I mean, this is something that's been coming up time and time again, and I want to address that point. Um, Jeremy Corbyn was booed in the Commons for asking that. Has the government, responded to Russia's request for evidence? I mean, that's crazy. That's like, put it this way, I would make this analogy. If a burglar is caught after stealing from someone's house, would the police hand over the items that have been stolen so the burglar can say, let me see these to see if I really stole them or not? I mean, you have to break it down. If it wasn't Russia, if it wasn't the Putin regime, who was it? Who was it? I mean, there was no indication that Sergei Skripal had any links to organized crime. Um, and the fact of the matter is, Putin is on record as saying that traitors to the Russian Federation would face consequences. He took a very hard line on that. And I think there is clear philosophy involved in this. After the Cold War, Russia felt humiliated. And Putin is an ideologue, so it makes sense that he would be targeting those individuals who are seen as traitors to the motherland. I mean, it's not just Sergei Skripal. There's up to 14 cases being investigated by the government that may have connections to Russia. Regarding the Jeremy Corbyn situation, people are saying, oh, but he was asking a valid question. Well, it's interesting that he is almost word for word parroting what Ambassador Alexander Shulgin was saying. You would expect that from the Russian ambassador. You'd expect them to be defensive. But for the leader of Her Majesty's opposition to basically parrot the line of a hostile foreign power is reprehensible. But then when you look a bit deeper and you consider that Corbyn's leading advisor, Seamus Milne, is well known for his attempts to downplay Stalin's crimes. This is a man who shared a stage with Vladimir Putin. He was literally feet away from Putin. The very same year, Russia invaded Crimea, and he went on to justify that invasion of Ukraine and the legal annexation of Crimea. I mean, that's utterly reprehensible. And this is the man who is advising Corbyn. Um, Among other things, this crisis has shown why Corbyn is utterly unfit to lead this country. He simply cannot be trusted on our national security. Because no matter what the situation, Corbyn will always, always, always blame Britain first. And I find that, frankly, quite sickening. But it isn't just Corbyn. There's a worrying number of people in this country who are tapping into the Kremlin's line. Now, if you hate the Conservatives and you don't trust the BBC, that's one thing. But to actually toe the narrative of the Kremlin is taking that to another level, and I find it reprehensible at a time when our country has clearly come under an attack from state terrorism. As for Russia demanding the evidence, why the hell would you hand this over to a regime that is based on pathological lies, that is running basically a gangster state, that suppresses dissent, that silences critical journalists, and has for years been involved in the mass disinformation um, in the West, has been involved in huge industrial scale distortion. I mean, even as I speak, there are conspiracy theories flooding the internet, being viewed tens of thousands of times, not just on RT. I'm going to be talking a bit later in the video about RT, but there are a lot of people, and they fall into two categories. One is paid Kremlin trolls, people who are knowingly pushing the line of the Kremlin because they're being paid for it because they're activists. And then the second category is insufferably naive people who think that they're being open minded, but they're just playing into Moscow's hands. And it's infuriating because it's so obvious what is going on here. Now, people say they don't trust the British government because of WMDs in Iraq, British intelligence. Well, Iraq was a huge cloud over the Blair administration, there's no question about that. And WMDs was obviously a huge part of that. But they're ignoring Russia's track record, specifically the track record of Putin. I mean, this is a regime that invaded Georgia, that invaded Ukraine, has propped up a brutal dictator in Syria. Today marks 7 years of that horrible war and being responsible for the ongoing suffering of the Syrian people. Russia's actions in Syria are utterly reprehensible. I mean, say what you want about Britain's actions in Saudi Arabia, but it doesn't change Russia's actions in Syria. And in point of fact, what we've been doing in Saudi Arabia, I am very uncomfortable about it, but we haven't directly been bombing Yemen, whereas, say, in Saudi Arabia, I should say, with Saudi Arabia, we haven't been directly bombing Yemen. Russia has been directly involved in the massacre of civilians in Syria. But I really have no respect for those whose answer to everything is to blame the West first, and in this case specifically blame Britain first every time. I have very little patience with such people because all they are doing is helping the Kremlin. You could argue that Corbyn's questions, and actually it wasn't just Corbyn, Vince Cable also brought the issue up of Russian oligarchs. Now, those, you can say that they're reasonable questions, but at least Vince Cable had the decency and the common sense to not pander to Moscow's line. He called the threat what it is, Russian state aggression. Jeremy Corbyn will not do that, and I doubt he ever will. He's attacking Russian millionaires, but he will not attack the Putin regime. Why not? Why not? Could it be that his advisor, Seamus Milne, is influencing him to that regard? Or could it be that that is Corbyn's own ideology? Either way, it shows why Corbyn is utterly unfit for number 10, because you can point out all the important things on social issues, on welfare, on Brexit, on all those things. But fundamentally, arguably the number one priority of any prime minister is the security of the nation. Now, judge May how you will, but at least she has got the tone right. And I believe she's responded to this well. She's shown strength, she's shown a robust response, she has not been a pushover. And if we look to the 70s, the Heath administration responded robustly. They expelled far more diplomats even in this situation Um, May's expelling 23 Russian personnel. The Heath administration, I believe it was over 100. Now, Russian covert actions in the UK dramatically declined after that, so it had an effect. That would have been under the Brezhnev administration or the Brezhnev years. I think Putin is a man who only understands force. I mean, it's only been weeks, days, since he's boasted about Russian nuclear capabilities. If it came to a direct military confrontation between Britain and Russia, Russia would probably win. Russia has approximately 7,000 nuclear warheads. We have 215. They have a far larger military in terms of manpower. So you have to, people say, why would, what intention would Russia have to do this? I would reverse the question. Why would we initiate it? Lavrov said it's a distraction from Brexit, but what on earth would this achieve? I mean, how would this help Theresa May? Because we clearly could not win a military conflict with Russia. So it wouldn't achieve anything. But I find it infuriating. People are acting as if Britain has initiated this. It wasn't Britain that decided to assassinate Alex Salmond or George Galloway in Moscow. It was Russia that decided to try and assassinate a former FSB agent in Britain, someone they saw as a traitor. Sergei Skripal, incidentally, had got British citizenship. Now, you could argue that I've heard people say, well, he's not a priority for Putin, but the point is, he's not the only one. There have been many, many people who have been critical of Putin have ended up dead in mysterious circumstances. That is an irrefutable fact. I mean, the people who are playing the devil's advocate for the Kremlin right now have obviously learned not a damn thing from the Litvinenko affair, and that's remarkable. It really is. So I have, I don't want to see any conflict with Russia. I take no pleasure from this situation, and I'm concerned about the situation of Britons living in Russia right now, whether they be diplomats, people working there, business people. I'd imagine it's a very uncomfortable position to be in, but it was Russia that initiated this. And the arrogance and the sarcasm and the way they have responded to this has been utterly crass. Um, it's just, and I just find it insufferable that there are people who are towing Moscow's line right now. What more evidence do they want? There is a history there. There is the threats that Putin has made. There has been tests at Porton Down. There is abundant evidence to show that in all likelihood the Kremlin was behind this. But I think these people are not going to be satisfied until they see Britain humiliated, because the logic is to blame Britain first. That's, make of that what you will, but I know where I stand with it, and I find it, people who will stab their country in the back and play the advocate for a hostile, foreign, very powerful state is shocking. It really is. Um, I'm going to round this up soon, but I'll close with a few words about RT. It's obviously been brought up the possibility of RT being blocked. Ofcom is currently investigating the possibility of that. Now, the Prime Minister didn't mention that in her proposals. She mentioned it initially, but it hasn't been one of the proposals so far. I mean, it hasn't been one of the steps taken so far. It's still being reviewed. Obviously, it's not a simple matter. Personally, I would dearly love to see RT blocked, but I do accept that it isn't a simple matter because it would mean two things. Firstly, there would be reprisals. The BBC and other Western outlets would be blocked in Russia. That would obviously make life difficult for British journalists. I don't want to see that, but that is the situation we are in. Um, the Independent today was saying that RT's influence is limited, so there wasn't a need to do that. It's only got 150,000 it's only got an audience of 150,000 people in the UK. I would strongly question that. Maybe they're talking about the TV figures, but including its outreach online, it's a lot higher. And when you then extend that to the sort of disinformation that it is spreading, I mean, they couldn't help themselves. They had this fairground music as they were quoting British politicians today, Boris Johnson, Gavin Williamson, Theresa May, and they were basically taking the piss. And I have to be honest, my human sentiment when I hear British accents on RT, either working for RT or parroting their line, I find it infuriating. I really do. Um, so I would dispute that RT has a limited influence. I think it has an increasingly growing influence, and that deeply concerns me. It's a weapon. It's not just an alternative media network. It's not just another opinion. It is part of the Russian state. And those who make these analogies like, oh, what about the BBC? What about CNN? Well, this is my response to that. I am not saying the BBC is above criticism or CNN, and I have not been shy of criticizing the BBC myself. The BBC is biased, of course it is. Every network is biased. But the point is, we have Ofcom in the UK. We have a media regulator. Russia doesn't have such a body. And there's simply no logical comparison between the BBC's relation to the British government versus RT's relation to the Russian government. There simply is no comparison. The BBC, for all its faults, does interview government ministers, does put them on the spot. I mean, for goodness sake, look at the way Jeremy Paxman interrogates politicians. Would you see the equivalent on RT with Putin's inner circle? No, you wouldn't. So it's a completely phony comparison. People who are making that comparison are just showing their utter naivety in this sort of whataboutery game because there is no comparison. So personally, I'd love to see RT blocked. I, I don't think it's going to happen because I think that Ofcom and others are going to be thinking, oh, well, the BBC will be blocked. And probably media networks here won't want to see that. But we need to be absolutely clear about what RT is. And I think if we don't block it, then at the very least, it should come under far more heat. It should be mercilessly scrutinized and criticized. It's been basically getting away with anti-Western propaganda for years. The sole purpose of RT, it was set up by Russian nationalists primarily to discredit the West at every opportunity. Look at stance on Scottish independence. Look at stance on the Catalan situation. RT never, ever reports Western countries in a positive light. It brings on people who are disgruntled or have a grudge against the West, people like Alex Salmond and George Galloway and Ken Livingstone. That's its agenda. Even some of its own staff have quit on air because of its agenda in the Ukraine situation. I mean, RT is a weapon. It's not simply another point of view. I'd love to see RT blocked, but I don't think it's going to happen. So if we're not going to block it, let's let's be far more let's be far more robust in seeing it for what it is, and also challenging the naivety of those who blindly believe it, as I've tried to do. Because to me, people who say that RT is just an alternative point of view away from the mainstream media, as I've said before, RT is mainstream media. It's the Russian establishment, but it's to say that it's harmless is so naive. It's unbelievable. And I'll round it up there because I've spoken for a while, but it'll be interesting to see where this thing goes. I'm, I take no pleasure from this, and I have nothing against the average Russian citizen. But it was Russia that initiated this, not the United Kingdom.